welcome to our August webinar series. This is week 2 of our August series. We had a very insightful and informational presentation last week. It was presented by Armando Galeno, so thank you, Armando, once again for the presentation last week. So this week, we're actually going to be taking a dive into inclusive education. I just want to mention that this presentation is brought to you by NJ4S Union Hub, and we are so excited to be having Briana Ampadu. She is our newest member of the NJ4S family. She'll be presenting our presentation today. She's going to be giving us an insightful presentation regarding the experience in the education system with our children from immigrant families and immigrant communities coming in. I think that this is a wonderful topic, granted our population within Union County. So before I turn it over to Briana, just a little bit about her. She's a prevention consultant at Prevention Links, where she serves the NJ4S Union Hub. Briana holds a Bachelor's of Science in Public Health and a Master of Public Health, both with concentrations in community health education. She's passionate about educating the community on various topics, but she has a particular interest in sex education and is dedicated to advancing the cause of promoting safe and healthy lifestyles. In her free time, she enjoys cooking, photography, and actively participating in community activities. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Briana.
Once again, welcome everyone to this webinar for today. Thank you all for taking the time out to come and tune into the webinar. Today's webinar is titled Inclusive Education, Tackling Challenges in the Lives of Immigrant Students. Today, we will be discussing challenges these students face and how to create a supportive environment and equitable learning for them. The main topics for today will be inclusive education. What is inclusive education? How does this influence students within their classrooms and the school systems? Immigrant students, what are they categorized as and who they are within New Jersey? Common challenges students face and resources that we can help them with. So inclusive education is the integration or inclusion of all students in the same classrooms and in the same schools without exception. When we think of inclusive education, we think of the approach and the values and diversity that all students, regardless of their background or abilities, have equal access to quality education. The importance of inclusivity doesn't only emphasize with immigrant students, but also with the entire school community by fostering an understanding and respect. The New Jersey Department of Education defines immigrant students as students who are between the ages of 3 to 21, who are not born in the U.S. or any U.S. territories, and have not attended one or more schools for 3 full academic years within the U.S. When we think of immigrant students, we think of individuals who have moved from their respective countries to another, and often for better opportunities or safety. The diversity within the immigrant student population can include different countries of origin, languages, and cultural backgrounds. We're going to dive into some myths about immigrant students. So one of the many myths is immigrant students do not require academic assistance. This is entirely not true. Students learn at different paces, and all students need academic assistance. Just piggybacking off of Jasmine's comment, a lot of educators believe that students from certain countries either do not need the assistance or need more assistance, things of that nature. And I remember reading an article way back about how an Asian immigrant student came to the US and their teacher automatically assumed that they didn't need any help. The student didn't understand the curriculum and it was very new to them. And that teacher just didn't ask for the help, so they had to advocate for themselves, which shouldn't be the case for students. Another myth is language barriers make it impossible to obtain education. This is not true. Many students do come to the US already knowing English, and we offer many programs in English and language support, which we'll also touch up on later on with ESL and other bilingual services. This is some statistics from the Department of Homeland Security, and we will be focusing on the years 2020 and 2022. So with 2020, why do you think there was a major decrease in 2020?
It could be COVID.
Yeah, definitely COVID. It restricted our borders, so a lot of immigrant students weren't coming in to continue their education, and they were also leaving to go back to their respective countries. In 2022, the data from the bottom up, Asia had 367,654 students come to the US. Europe had 161,908 students. South America had 76,862. North America had 50,962. Africa had 39,072 students, and other countries had 5,487 students. With this data from the Center for Immigration Studies, which merged references from the Census Bureau and Google Maps, just to keep in mind, it's looking at the immigrant student households, and yellow being the lowest and red being the highest. So what are some thoughts you have on this data, and where do you see the highest amount of immigration within New Jersey? Feel free to unmute yourself or put it in the chat.
Is the highest amount of immigration in northern New Jersey?
Yeah, so we see up here in the northern New Jersey area, we have a high population. And with that, in Elizabeth, specifically in Union County, students from immigrant households is 79%. With two major countries these students are coming from is the Dominican Republic and El Salvador, and the poverty rates within immigrant households and US-born households are 23%. These percentages are high, and we most likely have interacted with all these students as well. So we know the populations that they are in, which we'll get into with their mental health and things of that nature. So some common challenges immigrant students face are cultural knowledge, language barriers, academic challenges, legal status, separation from family, and financial burdens. With cultural knowledge, students have different upbringings than parents, and parents not understanding their children's lives in a new country. This is a huge barrier because the parent may come from a prospective country that is completely different than American culture. The culture that they are living in is quite different, and in the generation as well is different. These students are facing many challenges, and it could be a disconnect with the parent and the child, where the child feels as though they may not have as much support, and the parent may just not know how to click with their child within the challenges that they may face within the schooling system. And then also different cultural practices. Prospective students can come from a culture, for example, that for lunch, they go home for lunch, versus in America, most of the schooling students are in their school grounds to eat lunch. So it's a different culture within everything that they do here. Language barriers, limited English proficiency, communication difficulties, and barriers within the classroom, healthcare system, and social integration. So with that, limited English proficiency, creates a barrier within the classroom. Students may not be obtaining all of the information that they need for the curriculum that they're learning, and that causes a disconnect between the teacher and the student. So we have multiple.
I didn't want to cut you off, but something that I was thinking about this is that at some point the child becomes heavily is held with a heavy responsibility as either a translator or a connector to communication with the between the parent and someone else. So the parents might heavily depend on their child for translating. You know, it could be a heavy burden on the kid now, since they're, maybe it's a little bit easier for someone who's younger to learn English, and now you know, they're almost like the parent to the parent sometimes.
Yeah, thank you so much, Safa. And we see that a lot, like within classrooms, like one-on-ones with teachers, and like in the healthcare system, where the child is being the translator for their parent. It is a huge burden, and it's a lot for them as well. With social integration, having the language barrier can cause a disconnect within other students, other friends, creating friends because of the fact that they may not be speaking the same language entirely. With academic challenges, gaps in prior education. So some of these students can come from a prospective country that has an interrupted schooling or different educational system, which means they are learning at a different pace. And that different pace may not be the same pace as it is in America, which will cause the gap. The different educational standards and practices will also pose as a challenge. They may not be used to certain things that teachers are doing, or they're teaching, or the way they're teaching may not be convenient for them as well. And then also just adapting to the education system, which is a huge pressure, trying to learn a curriculum and understand it. With legal status, the uncertainty around immigration status, this can pose a huge stress and barrier, especially if students are constantly worrying about where their immigration lies within the US and how that affects them and their families. Their access to resources, they may think because of their status that they can't receive certain resources or services to support them. And then also the pressures of employment. Some of these students coming in have to have a certain visa to be employed in the US, so that's a huge barrier within itself. And then financial burdens, providing for the family, especially if the child is here alone or their parents and siblings are back home and they're here with like an aunt or an uncle. They are the sole providers, which can cause a lot of pressure on them, which ties into the balancing work and school. Students will need to balance both the work and school life, and the responsibilities of that impacts their mental and physical health. They may be working late nights and going to school, so that can cause times for not being able to study as much or not getting homework done. So it impacts their academic success. And then once again, the family financial circumstances, if their family comes from poverty, then it causes a huge distress because that child feels as though they have to be the sole provider and put in money to help the family. And lastly, separation from family, feeling of isolation and homesickness, coming to a new country with just yourself or with your other family members and not your parents or your siblings and those you've been around for years is a huge mental health barrier. You may feel as though like you just want to be home with your family and they're not here with you. And then adopting without the family as well ties into that. serving as the prime example back home to follow in coming abroad. If they have siblings that are not in the US but are back home in their respective country, then they are the prime example where they have the pressure of being the person, like the token person in a way, and allowing their siblings or their cousins to follow suit. Like, oh, I can't fail would be like one of the prime things in their heads, which causes a lot of pressure. And lastly, how can we help? So with language support, providing ESL, which is English as a second language, providing those programs will definitely help immigrant students to improve their English proficiency. And then also adding in bilingual education and translation services. So providing webinars like this or workshops with other languages will definitely help students and their families. With cultural competence is the ability of an individual to understand and respect values and beliefs that differ across cultures, and to basically consider adding that into or implementing that into health education and promotion programs and interventions. Also adding the cultural responsive teachings, the practices, and adding the respect to different students and their cultural backgrounds. And also just emphasizing on the importance of diversity within the school to create the sense of belonging and inclusive environment. With counseling services, the need for school counseling to support the mental and emotional well-being of students, because coming into a different country is very, very different and can cause a lot of life changes. And it's important that these students are getting the resources they need, and especially with having people that are there for them to listen to them and things of that nature. And also with that, the benefits of peer support groups. Students can share their experiences while also finding comfort in knowing that they are not alone within the country or the schooling that they're in. And with NJ4S, we do offer this with the Tier 2 small groups, and then also with the Tier 3, with the counseling services, we'll be able to help as well. With community building, the importance of creating a welcoming school environment. Students should feel valued and included, so it's important for us to create that sense of belonging, especially with adding cultural events and activities where they can celebrate diversity within the student population. With family engagement, the importance of involving parents in the education so that they can empower their children to learn, and providing resources and support for the family so it can help bridge the gap between home and school life. And lastly, community partnerships. The benefits of collaborating with local agencies and organizations to provide additional resources and support for immigrant students, which will enhance their education. And NJ4S will definitely have a lot of programming for that as well for students coming from immigrant student backgrounds. I would like to end this presentation with a powerful and inspiring quote from Jenny Rivera, who is not only a successful artist, but also an advocate for the immigrant community. And with that, the quote reads, "If I had the opportunity to speak to a young immigrant girl that just arrived to the US, the advice I would have for her would be ask, speak, search, because there are opportunities out there, and know that you aren't the only immigrant or the last to come to this country. Many that have come before you have succeeded. It is possible." And as professionals, it's our responsibility to ensure that immigrant students are aware and have the access to opportunities available to them. And once again, creating the sense of belonging and reinforcing the idea that immigrant students are not alone. Encouraging our students to advocate for themselves by asking questions, seeking help, and just taking advantage of our resources and the resources in their communities. And lastly, we will have meaningful connections throughout our careers. So with this webinar and many other webinars and workshops, you'll continue to educate yourselves on the immigrant populations that will not only help yourself, but help the communities that you serve and support.
Briana, thank you so much for such an engaging and very informative webinar. I can attest that I have my mother-in-law who joined me with the watching this webinar. She's in education, and her school is a very diverse school. She has a lot of students coming in from other countries, so she can attest that this was very a very filling presentation that could be very useful, especially for us and the communities that we serve. Unfortunately, for some reason, I am locked out of my email, so I'm unable to include the link for the feedback, but we will be sending a link for the feedback. I don't know if you can pull it up, Whitney, really quickly for me. Thank you. I'd like to thank everyone for joining. If you'd like to keep up with what we have going on in the NJ4S Union Hub, please feel free to follow us on social media. It is at NJ4S Union Hub on Instagram. You can follow us on Facebook. And if you have any suggestions for future programs, webinars, if you'd like to see something in the future that you would like, to learn a little bit more information about, feel free to send us an email at NJ4S Union Hub at preventionlinks.org.